say he's the best Prime Minister we never had. His enemies claimed that his grand social ambitions led him to sell out and betray his Labour roots as the son of a Welsh miner.
No, I never had the impression that he was a snob, not at all.
What do you think of your granddad?
I think he's a great whiskey drinker as well as champagne.
If he'd gone on looking as if he came from that Welsh valley, I think his route to the Premiership would have been unstoppable.
It's 7:35 a.m. precisely. Roy Jenkins sets off on his morning constitutional at his country home near Oxford. A man of great precision, Lord Jenkins has held many of the top political posts. He was a reforming Home Secretary, an austere Chancellor of the Exchequer, and founding father of the SDP. He retains at the age of 75 his lifetime's ideals of liberal internationalism and the determination never to waste a minute of his still crowded life. His early morning walk is centred on his tennis court.
I try to walk 45 minutes before breakfast. Exactly 45 minutes. Shorter would be too short, longer would consume too much time. Now, I'm going to do a more complicated manoeuvre. We ought to turn round according to a left pattern I've worked out. You can turn left, sharp. Let's do it very sharp. I walk, and I walk very vigorously, and I time it all very hard by my watch. And I'm delighted when it's over, and I then feel mildly virtuous and relieved of any need to try to take any further exercise during the day.
But the man, fascinated with figures, never quite got the timing right that might have taken him to number 10, though it was the job he most wanted.
I don't think I had quite enough ruthless steel in me. Most people who have seized an opportunity to become Prime Minister have had this streak of almost obsessive ruthlessness. And I don't think I quite had that. I think perhaps I had slightly too many other interests. Wanted to be Prime Minister, but I didn't want to be Prime Minister on any terms. I wanted to be Prime Minister on my own terms, I think.
Earlier this year, Jenkins won a Whitbread Prize for his biography of Gladstone. The Liberal Prime Minister, known as the Grand Old Man, is one of Jenkins' political heroes. Jenkins' fondness for the high life sometimes obscures the fact that he works as hard as he plays. The latest of his 18 books was judged good enough to challenge Salman Rushdie and others for the overall Whitbread Prize for the Book of the Year.
How do you compare Roy Jenkins with Salman Rushdie? It's not like comparing a red setter with a Pekingese.
Jenkins' greatest chance of the Labour Premiership came when he was made Chancellor of the Exchequer. The man obsessed with always being in the right place at the right time had just turned 47. He was a favourite of the Tory press, although the students of East Anglia seemed less impressed.
May I now introduce Mr. Roy Jenkins to the audience here. Mr. Jenkins has had a very remarkable and varied career. He's been the son of a miner. He went to a Welsh grammar school. He won first-class honours at Balliol College, Oxford.
The people in this hall now, most of us, want your explanation of why a Labour government isn't socialist, and we'd like to know what you propose to do about becoming socialist.
God, I can't think what I'm going to say to that.
Now, it's certainly the case that after 4 years and 2 months of Labour government, we haven't nearly done everything that ought to be done and everything we would like to be done. No, you know, it doesn't help to shout lies. But if you've got a good case, you can make it perfectly rationally without shouting about it. If you think back to the position in this country 30 years ago, in which I was around, but you weren't around. I was around. But you... No, 30 years ago, Welsh miners' sons didn't live in houses with many servants, as a matter of fact. Now, would you please...
I remember vaguely hoping that they would rush the platform, and I'd have a sort of very light flesh wound, because at least that would bring the proceedings to an end. What I didn't realize was that it did me, on the whole, more good than all the strenuous measures I was taking at the Treasury in those days. Going back in the train from Norwich to Liverpool Street next morning, I'd never been so popular.
The opinion polls rated Jenkins the country's most popular politician, and he had the ideal working-class credentials for a Labour leader. But within his own party, what was seen as his social pretensions could alienate potential supporters. An old colleague was the Labour MP for Pontypool, where Jenkins came from.
This virus of snobbery has prevented him from being, as he should have been, the Prime Minister of Britain. It's extraordinary to me, this man is a great parliamentarian, absolutely superb. Take him down from there and ask him to be with ordinary folk. And he's ill at ease. Wonderful at a dinner table, marvellous at high table. But when he's come down to Pontypool later and was with me, I felt I was acting as an interpreter between him and his own people.
Roy is in some ways a shy man, and he's partly overcome the shyness by building up this facade and style of a very characteristic style of speaking, of mannerisms, of the way he uses his hands, like a sort of turning bird cage. And that becomes a barrier between him and other people.
I wasn't good at what I would call House of Commons bonhomie. I wasn't good at backslapping. I wasn't good at chaff. I think on the whole, I didn't become leader, but the temperament which makes people leaders makes them not very good at backslapping fraternization.
Although it is said that John Major is actually rather good at that.
But he's not very good at being a leader.
At first sight, Jenkins would seem to have moved a long way from his own background. His father, Arthur Jenkins, was a Welsh coal miner. Born in 1920, Roy Jenkins grew up in the South Wales mining valleys near Pontypool. He went to Pentwyn Mixed Infants and is now the school's most famous old boy.
We told the 5-year-olds we had a very important visitor coming, and
These are 5-year-olds.
yes, yes.
That one looks like Michael Foot, which I think is which I really think most captures a certain spirit in me. I think Rachel does.
Do you think so?
Tell Rachel, I think she thinks.
I will do.
Jenkins' school overlooked the Monmouthshire valleys, and he says the area can still clutch his heartstrings.
I have a strong feeling for Monmouthshire and a certain feeling for Wales as a whole, but as I don't believe in assuming mantles which aren't there, to say that I was Welsh in the sense that Lloyd George was Welsh, that his whole culture, his whole outlook, his language was Welsh, would be an exaggeration. I don't like exaggerations. But the coming back here is always an interesting and evocative experience for me.
Jenkins' father worked his way up from the pits and became a leader of the mining union. In the social hierarchy of the pit valleys, both Arthur and Hattie Jenkins had become figures of some standing by the time their son was 6. Roy Jenkins was their only child.
I don't think I was actually spoilt in any sort of crude sense of the word, but I suppose I had an inherent sense that I was quite an important person to them.
In the general strike of 1926, Arthur Jenkins organized his men to march and demonstrate against blacklegs who were defying the strike. He was arrested and charged with inciting a riot. Though he denied the charge, he was found guilty and sentenced to 9 months in prison. The news was kept from the young Roy Jenkins.
It did become a bit of a guilty secret. It's certainly not something I've ever been ashamed of, or ever since I fully knew about it, have attempted to conceal. Or in later years, my father would promote it. But neither of us wished to exploit it.
It was his mother Hattie who'd concealed the news of the imprisonment from her son, saying her husband had gone abroad to work. There were many in the valleys who felt that her motivation was a sense of social shame.
Well, she was a right snob. I think that Roy possibly got his airs and graces from his mother. And you ask anybody in the area, then they'll tell you about his mother. Everybody knows that. She always acted like she was a duchess. She had the royal wave, and if you spoke to her, she would answer with just a little polite smile and nod of her head.
She was animated, gracious lady. She was always very well turned out in hats, but most people wore hats in those days. I recognise her type quite often in South Wales ladies of note and quality whom I see from time to time.
And you were saying that...
But the idea that she was a repellently disdainful or snobbish figure is absolutely nonsense. She was a very popular figure. Duchesses can sometimes be popular.
Roy Jenkins claims that his father was a greater influence on him socially than his mother. A local councillor and a magistrate, Arthur Jenkins was elected Labour MP for their hometown of Pontypool in 1935. He went on to work for the Labour leader Clement Attlee as his parliamentary private secretary. Home movies show that as a schoolboy, Roy Jenkins was used to the leaders of the Labour Party, like Herbert Morrison, seen on the left, visiting the family home. And his father's evident enjoyment of the good life was imbibed by the young Roy Jenkins. The family now had a live-in maid, and Arthur Jenkins was the proud owner of a motor car. As a coal miner, he'd studied in Paris and had developed a wider sense of the world than Roy Jenkins' mother.
He always had this outward-looking view. He rather liked provided they were men of public responsibility and relatively liberal views, he rather liked the country gentry society of East Monmouthshire, the people he'd met on the county council. And we quite often used to go and visit them for lunch or tea. And insofar as people think I've got slightly grand, slightly Whiggish tastes, I think they came more from him than they did from my mother.
To his father's delight, Roy Jenkins won a place at Oxford, where half a century later he was to be elected Chancellor, beating his college contemporary Ted Heath. As Chancellor, Jenkins presents an honorary doctorate to his fellow Oxonian, the American President, Bill Clinton.
In verum excellentissimum Gulielmum Jefferson Clinton.
Jenkins went to Balliol, where one of his tutors nicknamed him Nature's Old Etonian. Balliol is renowned for producing public servants and for instilling a tranquil consciousness of effortless superiority. By now, he'd lost his Welsh accent.
I never remember making a particular conscious effort to change my accent in any way. I think I spoke in the way I do now from the age of 18 or 19 onwards, probably.
And what about the famous way you pronounce your R's?
Oh, well, that's a sort of semi-physical, doesn't make me deficiency. I mean, I'm not claiming sympathy for it. A whole variety of people have not been able to pronounce their R's very ruggedly. Ruggedly is perhaps a word I oughtn't to use too much.
Jenkins was an active student politician, determined to follow his father and become a Labour MP. He was a leading light in the Oxford Union Society, the nursery for future cabinet ministers. But in 1940 he was beaten for the presidency of the Union. At the time he regarded it as the greatest setback in his life. He left Oxford in 1942 and worked in intelligence, deploying his fascination with numbers to try to decipher German codes at the top-secret Bletchley Park. He'd met Jennifer Morris, a Cambridge history student at a left-wing summer school earlier in the war.
She was the first proper sort of girlfriend I had then.
And what happened when you met her?
First I fell in love with her.
I remember seeing this rather handsome young man playing cricket, and within 2 or 3 days we were talking to each other and went away. At the end of the week we left together, so it was fairly quick.
What was it you found attractive about Jennifer
He fell in love with God. What does anyone find attractive about people? A combination of their mind, their personality, their character.
I just think he's been, and always has been, the most engaging companion I've ever known. I mean, many other attractions too, but just to be with, it's always been, it's always been better to be with him than to be with anybody else.
They married in 1945 and have remained together ever since. 3 years later, Jenkins won a by-election, and at the age of 27, he'd become the youngest MP in the House. After briefly flirting with the left, he settled on the right of the party, with a set of libertarian and internationalist beliefs. He became a fervent European, convinced that Britain should adjust to her post-imperial status and join the common market. In the 50s, the Labour leader Hugh Gaitskell led the battle against the left for the soul of the party, and his trusted lieutenant was Roy Jenkins.
But I beg the conference not to react to this discussion by adopting an attitude of unyielding conservatism. We exist to change society. We aren't likely to be very successful if we are horrified at any suggestion of changing ourselves.
Jenkins became a leading member of the Gaitskell set, which combined high politics with high living. The overriding aim was to create a new Labour Party and make Gaitskell Prime Minister.
Hugh Gaitskell remains the one person in politics I've not merely liked but have loved, who really did have an inspirational effect upon me as a leader. To me, he was an immensely engaging companion. He set more than any politician I've known a great store by friendship. Some would say too much. I mean, either you were a friend of Gaitskell's, in which case you couldn't do much wrong, or you weren't a friend of his, in which case you couldn't do much, if any, right.
Jenkins was definitely one of us, so far as Gaitskell was concerned. He and Jennifer now had 3 children, but even though Jenkins sought to help create New Labour, he was no new man.
I've been a fairly old-fashioned parent, not in the sense of being a disciplinarian parent, but in the sense of believing, I'm afraid, that a large part of parenthood was the mother's job. And I never spent much time on the domestic chores of parenthood.
I mean, I have never seen him change a nappy, but I wouldn't have indeed have allowed him one, because certainly the pin would have gone straight through the tummy. It would not have been a good result at all. He's very clumsy. He can't peel an apple.
Can you unscrew bottles, which I can't?
He's most unlikely to be able to knock a nail in or mend a fuse. I don't suppose he'd know what a fuse was or where the fuse box was.
At the 1962 Labour conference, Jenkins saw his political hero dancing with the left-wing enemy. Gaitskell was seeking to unite the party on the divisive issue of Europe, and in a nationalistic speech to the party conference, his leader dismayed Jenkins by opposing British entry into the common market.
It does mean the end of Britain as an independent nation-state. I make no apology for repeating it, the end of 1,000 years of history. You may say, all right, let it end. But my goodness, it's a decision that needs a little care and thought.
I was very miserable during that speech, but I was much more miserable when he died 4 months later. Looks all right there. Looks vigorous. Too vigorous in some of those ideas one didn't like, but it he must have been already sickening, I suppose, for that.
The death of the man he loved left Jenkins disillusioned and depressed, and he thought seriously about leaving politics altogether and becoming a full-time writer. He'd already produced a number of acclaimed political biographies, and he felt that his writing helped to give a balance to his life.
I think politicians need, even if they're going to be good politicians, need other things to fall back on. And I didn't want to be wholly dependent on the smiles of whips or the chances of political advancement or not. I wanted to have some compensating satisfactions in life.
Harold Wilson, the man the Gateskiellites loved to hate, won the 1964 election. And to Jenkins' agreeable surprise, he was made aviation minister. Jenkins visited an aero engine factory, well aware that his new post, although outside the cabinet, was at the centre of political controversy.
Tonight's encounter is with Roy Jenkins, Minister of Aviation, who holds one of the hottest seats in British government, where so far he's scored a growing success.
Jenkins' sure-footed parliamentary performances had led him to being tipped as a future Prime Minister.
I've only been a minister for 4.5 months. You mustn't expect one to start putting one's sights too high.
But you don't exclude the highest office.
I think it's highly unlikely, but I'm highly unlikely. I don't exclude it, I don't include it. I don't think about it.
After only 4 months, Jenkins the aviator was offered the cabinet post of Education Secretary. But the job didn't inspire him, and taking a risk, he turned it down.
The gamble did pay off because 11 months later I became Home Secretary, which was a job I wanted very much to do.
Jenkins wanted to be Home Secretary because he'd had for the past 6 years a fully prepared agenda for wholesale reform of our social and sexual laws.
My basic position is a libertarian position, a view that the onus of proof is always very much on those who want to restrict the liberty of the individual. My basic position remains, and I hope that I can give some effect to that position as Home Secretary.
At the age of 45, Jenkins was one of the youngest ever Home Secretaries. He set about changing the moral framework of our society as the 60s swung. Abortion and homosexuality were legalized. Divorce was made easier. And theatre censorship abolished altogether.
I was trying to make Britain a more liberal and open society. Because I thought we lived in a repressive climate in which the state tried to interfere too much in people's legitimate liberties and private lives. If you want to stop people doing something which they enjoy doing, which they believe is within their liberty of action, then you've got to have an overwhelming social case. Of course, I don't believe in people going around and doing things which do a great deal of damage to other people. But you have to, if you're going to stop them, you shouldn't do it out of prejudice or out of habit, but only because you can show that a definite social evil results from their private conduct. I believe private conduct broadly should be a private matter.
While Jenkins preferred to talk of a civilized rather than a permissive society, he was accused of creating a monster that was amoral and out of control.
What Mr. Tebbit, Mrs. Thatcher used to do from time to time, used to fulminate against the evils which I was alleged to have introduced in the 60s and to blame this for nearly all the ills of modern-day society. What I noticed is that though they were both part of governments, indeed Mrs. Thatcher, the head of a government, with great majorities in the House of Commons for over a decade, there was not a single one of the reforms of the 1960s which they've expunged from the statute book.
In 1967, after devaluing the pound, Wilson faced a battle of political survival. He reluctantly decided to make Jenkins Chancellor in place of Jim Callaghan. For Wilson feared Jenkins' political ambitions, and he knew that by giving him the Treasury, he was creating a formidably qualified rival for his own job.
Sorry to keep you waiting.
Mr. Jenkins, sir, what are your thoughts about leaving the Home Office?
I'm very sorry in many ways to be leaving the Home Office, but I've greatly enjoyed the past 2 years.
Regarded by many as Mr. Wilson's foremost rival. Is this a big help to you going into the Treasury?
No, I look forward to working in very close partnership with Mr. Wilson as Chancellor.
You don't think you've gone up in the so-called leadership stakes?
I'm not thinking about leadership stakes. I'm thinking about those formidable tasks waiting for me at the Treasury.
I think that was a pretty awful interview, if you really want to know. I've always thought it's a very good rule that no statement is interesting if you can't imagine a sane man saying the direct opposite of it. By that standard, no statement in that interview was of the remotest interest, because no sane man could have said the reverse. Are you a rival to Mr. Wilson? Yes, of course I am. I'll have him out in no time. Instead of, I look forward to working in close partnership. Are you keen to be going to the Treasury? No, I'm very frightened about it. I mean, these would have been remarks They wouldn't all have been true, but, I mean, they would have had a certain impact and interest, whereas that was bland complacency.
Facing a dismal economic legacy, Jenkins' rigorous austerity measures sparked bitter protests. He was accused of being the best Conservative Chancellor since the war.
Socialism! That's what they call it, my God!
It is absolutely untrue that Labour taxation measures have been unfair, and I can assure you they've been very different from Tory taxation measures. We live in a mixed economy, and we are going to... And I've never suggested that we're going to be able to live in other than a mixed economy, but I believe that we can civilize this mixed economy and make it a great deal fairer than it has been.
But as Jenkins' economic measures start to work, his political stock is rising, just when Wilson's is falling. Although the Chancellor is increasingly talked of as the next Prime Minister, he's coming under the growing suspicion of the Labour left for his personal lifestyle. A home in the country with its own tennis court, as well as a grand London house, children at public school, and a range of high social connections, all fuel the left's distrust.
God, I wish I could play tennis like that now.
What particularly aroused the resentment of the left was the fact that Jenkins, like his hero Gateskill, liked to surround himself with a group of political devotees.
I liked working in politics with people with whom I had close, personal, friendly relations. And I suppose if you have that feeling, maybe you attract a bit of reciprocation. And therefore, I found it easy to work with a group of people who had close affinity to me and with whom I felt a real sort of emotional link.
Roy is an impressive figure, very impressive, has a lot of friends and developed them by his social contacts and all the rest of it. I never thought the Labour Party could be run on the basis of dinner parties. I hardly had any, actually. Sandwich occasionally.
Jenkins refused to tone down his lifestyle to fit in with left-wing preconceptions. He argued that a love of fine claret and good living should not be the prerogative of Tory politicians.
I haven't tasted it. I smelt the corks, that's enough. One of the most bogus things in the world is this view that you taste a sip of wine, you know exactly the quality. Nobody does. Bogus.
He enjoys a good wine, he enjoys good food, he enjoys somewhat glittery company. What has always stood in the way of Roy's route to the premiership is partly, as I've said, the lack of overweening ambition, but secondly, his style, the things he likes doing, the way he likes to be, don't fit into Labour's image of what their leader ought to be.
You're reputed, Mr. Jenkins, to enjoy sophisticated and elegant living. Do you see any conflict, as some people do, between this and being a socialist?
I don't lead a particularly extravagant life. I think, I enjoy a lot of things. If by elegant one means does one like things to be attractive rather than unattractive, yes, I do. If by sophisticated one means does one like to know a wide range of people inside and outside politics, yes, I do. But I think this is a good thing for anyone who's in an active position in life today.
Jenkins and his wife give lunch parties virtually every weekend. The guest lists feature Oxford academics, old Jenkinsite politicians, and the odd sprinkling of stardust.
And Mrs. Thatcher passed out absolutely completely during the speech, but she had her head down in her soup plate, more or less. Whereas Ted, more like a horse, can sleep standing up.
Jenkins hates ever to eat alone. He works hard at keeping up with old colleagues and friends from the past.
He found Gladstone both much more interesting as he went along, and he liked him much more as he went along.
The feeling that there has been a witch hunt ever since they moved into the White House is very strong. I haven't been...
Why didn't you come to that Rothschild lunch on our Williams Festival?
Jenkins' wide range of friends in high places has been a feature of his life. But when he was a Labour cabinet minister, it aroused the distrust not just of the left, but of Harold Wilson himself. For unlike most other politicians, his friendships crossed party lines. He was great friends with the one-time Liberal MP Mark Bonham Carter and his wife Leslie. Another great friendship was with the moderate Tory MP Ian Gilmore. and his wife, Caroline. Mark Bonham Carter once remarked that Roy Jenkins' wife, Jennifer, shared none of the weaknesses of the flesh by which Roy might seem to be tempted.
I think there's something in that, though it shouldn't make her seem a cold, detached figure at all. I think in some ways she's a stronger character than I am.
And what does he mean by the weaknesses of the flesh by which you might seem to be tempted?
Drink, food, pleasure perhaps. Just pleasure generally. Pleasure is not a bad thing.
He told me once, which I thought was the best declaration you can make to your wife. He told me one day, I could never have been in love with anybody who was not very fond of Jennifer. And I think that's one of the nicest things you can say about your wife.
Do you think he's been in love with other people who
Well, I don't know. I know nothing about it. It's his sentimental life. We never talk about that.
I think he liked ladies.
What do you mean?
I mean what I say. I think he liked ladies. I think a title would be a great benefit to anybody who may want to attract Roy Jenkins.
That view of Jenkins had deep resonance in a party brought up on tales of its leaders, like Ramsay MacDonald being seduced by the charms of the upper classes and selling out a Labour government in exchange for an invitation from the society hostess, Lady Londonderry. And there was no doubting that Jenkins took pleasure in the company of glamorous and aristocratic women. He was a close friend of Jackie Kennedy, and he had a love affair with Jackie's sister, Princess Lee Radziwill. It was one of a number of love affairs that Jenkins had over the years, sometimes with the wives of friends. Yet remarkably, they didn't destroy his marriage, and both Roy and Jennifer Jenkins managed to remain friends with both husbands and wives. And Jenkins disputes one published account of his affair with Lee Radziwill.
I thought that was not accurate.
Not accurate?
Not accurate.
Did you not have an affair with Lee Radziwill?
I've never commented on these things because I think on the one hand, if you deny something, it's ungallant. If you confirm something, it's like budget secrets. Much better not talked about.
But a lot of your friends have talked about the love affairs that you've had. I wondered why you didn't put that in your autobiography.
I wouldn't have wished to do so.
I mean, were you ever concerned as a politician that they might be found out about?
No, I don't think I've done things I'm ashamed of.
But a number of people, Tory ministers, have been found out and have had to resign because of it. I just wondered whether you were ever concerned at that time about it.
I've never been worried about having to resign on issues of that sort. Been worried about whether I was going to resign, sometimes resigning, but on political issues.
In the late 60s, an increasingly beleaguered Harold Wilson came to believe that Jenkins was using his society connections to try to become Prime Minister. Wilson claimed to have evidence that Jenkins and his acolytes had met at the country house of a society hostess to plot Wilson's overthrow.
That was pure paranoia on his part. Absolutely insane fantasy. Trouble was, I always rather liked Harold Wilson. I didn't enormously respect him, but I rather liked him, and he always behaved, unless he was in a terrible corner, rather well towards me, so I wasn't full of vicious personal feeling against him.
And what did you think?
But maybe, you see, if one believes in power at all costs, that would be a totally irrelevant consideration. But I find it difficult to treat it as totally irrelevant.
Chancellor of the Exchequer, Mr. Roy Jenkins. You got that, have you?
Yes.
Good.
Yeah, that's it. I've locked my money up, by the way.
Very wise precaution. Who's got the key?
I have.
In the run-up to the 1970 general election, Jenkins received conflicting advice about what kind of budget to prepare. In the end, the high-minded Chancellor ignored political urgings to present a vote-catching budget and produced so low a feel-good factor that the left accused him of losing Labour the election.
I was absolutely convinced, and I'm still totally convinced, that the public are highly sceptical of giveaway budgets immediately before an election. And I don't think I'd won a single vote and might have lost them if I'd done a budget which might have looked as though it were an election bribe budget.
Yesterday men will be happy until politically they are today.
Ted Heath, Jenkins' old Balliol contemporary, had become Prime Minister and successfully led the negotiations for Britain to enter the common market. But just as in Gaitskell's time, the issue of Europe once again had a convulsive effect on the Labour Party. Although Harold Wilson had favoured entry while Prime Minister, now, to hold the party together, he came out against entry on the Tory terms. Jenkins himself had been elected deputy leader of the party and faced a dilemma. Should he recant on Europe, as Wilson wanted and the left were demanding, in the hope of overthrowing the hated Heath government? Or would he stick to his long-held principles, defy a three-line whip even though he was deputy leader, and vote in the Tory lobbies?
I was quite resolved that on what I regard as one of the decisive parliamentary votes of the century, I was not going to be in a position in which people said to me, "What did you do in the great vote, Grandpapa?" And I said I abstained. I was quite determined from the beginning that I was going to vote, and vote in favour of entry.
One of the things one has to say about Roy is that consistently his actions are more courageous than the image he gives. He gives the image of somebody who's sophisticated, willing to compromise, understands the way politics work, a little bit weary, a bit cynical. On every occasion when it has come down to a matter of conscience, I've never known Roy flinch from taking that act of conscience.
After the great vote, Jenkins and the 68 others who'd sided with the Tories were branded traitors. The activists' argument was that Jenkins was trying to have it both ways. His duty as the elected deputy leader was to follow the party line.
If it's laid down, then that's it. Either you accept it or you don't accept it. And if you don't accept it, be honest, Roy Jenkins, and get out.
6 months later, Jenkins did resign as deputy leader. He was growing increasingly disenchanted with Labour Party politics, and he bitterly opposed the left's attempt to reopen the issue of our membership with their call for a referendum. 3 years later, the campaign for a yes vote in the referendum was led by Jenkins, who was back in government. His experience of working with Liberals and moderate Tories offered him a future vision of how the centre might come together, and formed a vivid contrast with life in the Labour Party. Jenkins had become a target for attack by extremists of both left and right.
That is the National Front! That is the National Front! What we are confronted here this evening is a mindless clan who are determined to destroy and break up the Labour Party, to produce chaos in this country, and out of it, not to get democracy, but out of it, to get a position in which they believe that their own small minority might impose a regime of totalitarianism upon the great majority of the people of this country.
We've just heard from our staff at Westminster that the Prime Minister has resigned.
Wilson's surprise resignation brought the leadership election, for which Jenkins and his supporters had spent years doing their calculations. But in the ballot, Jim Callaghan won the premiership, with Michael Foot second and Jenkins a poor third.
I think by that time it wasn't in the stars that I was going to win. I was disappointed. I wanted to win, but it didn't surprise. Perhaps because it didn't surprise, it didn't shatter me. The leadership campaign a few years before, the likelihood is I would have won. But that moment had gone. To some extent, by resigning the deputy leadership, I'd underlined its going.
His apparent equanimity stemmed partly from the fact that he already had an attractive alternative job offer. At the start of 1977, Jenkins left the cabinet to become president of the European Commission. It was a moment of truth for the man whose Europeanism had helped cost him the premiership. How would his idealism survive the reality of the Brussels bureaucracy?
He discovered that being president of the Commission was to some extent a slightly hollow crown. The people that made and shaped Europe were actually the heads of state or the heads of government. In particular, they were the heads of government of France and Germany. Pretty well what they decided happened. In fact, they had decided on having Roy.
There's something to be said for doing the restricted session.
Jenkins fought successfully to ensure the President of the Commission attended World Economic Summits. His lasting legacy was to revive the idea of European monetary union that was to prove so controversial. But Jenkins says, "Je ne regrette rien."
I remain proud of having relaunched that idea of monetary union in 1977, and having produced, at any rate, a great deal more currency stability for all the member states of the European community, except, alas, my own member state.
Chancellor of the Exchequer.
It was Norman Lamont as Chancellor who suffered most directly from the effect of the ERM on Britain when he had to pull us out in the debacle of Black Wednesday. There's no love lost now between Jenkins and Lamont.
Roy Jenkins. I'm afraid he wasn't up to the job. It wasn't so much a question of policy, it was a question of whether one had the authority and the personality to do the job convincingly.
I think that this is a weakness in Roy Jenkins. He's always a man who, despite his grand status, goes for personalities. He thinks that not only was I not up to the job, Nigel Lawson was not up to the job, Mrs. Thatcher was not up to the job, Selwyn Lloyd was not up to the job, Harold Wilson was not up to the job. There was only one man who was up to the job, and that is clearly expressed in his own book. The only thing is, I just wish you could grow old gracefully and not be quite so bitter about other people.
I think Lamont handled that better than I remembered his handling it. I think he landed a few shells. I mean, I don't think it was actually true. My view that I'm perfect and nobody else is any good.
With Mrs. Thatcher now in power and Jenkins still at the Commission, his sense of time passing was becoming acute. He was nearly 60 and decided he had to act if he were ever to achieve his dream of breaking the mould of two-party politics.
I had been out of British politics for 5 years and was thought to have lived a fairly sybaritic life during this period. I'd been feeling for a little time that if I had sufficient guts, I ought to have a go at a centre party, because it was really centrist politics which I'd come to believe in. I thought that the Labour Party had got itself into an appalling mess. I didn't least like Thatcherite conservatism, and I thought there ought to be a third route.
So Shirley Williams and Dr. David Owen, along with Roy Jenkins and Bill Rogers, formed the Gang of Four. They set off together in close harmony to create a brand new social democratic party.
The next day he came a liberal activist, worked for them hard and loyally, and he sang as he went and canvassed the electorate, who'll come a losing deposits with me.
In the early days of the SDP, things could scarcely have gone more swimmingly. The man who loved numbers was now leader of the record breakers, as the new party soared to over 50% in the opinion polls.
They were tremendously exciting. They were almost the most exciting time of one's life. The strength of public response was such that we were swept along far more rapidly than we expected. And I found I began to enjoy campaigning much more than I had done previously.
The grassroots, Mr. Jenkins, was the same as mine. And you have left the grassroots, Mr. Jenkins.
There comes a time when you cannot, your life would be a living hypocrisy. And that's what's wrong with Mr. Healy and Mr. Hattersley, when you advocate policies, major policies you don't believe in.
Jenkins now urgently needed to win a seat in the Commons. His wife had become a formidable public figure in her own right. She was chairman of the Consumers Association, then of the National Trust, and was to be made a dame. She'd remained loyal to her husband.
For your support in this historic party,
and now she joined him full-time on the campaign trail as he stood for the SDP in the safe Tory seat of Glasgow Hillhead.
He is actually patently honest. One of the things that he has many disadvantages, I can tell you, as a husband, but one of the things he does not do and will never do is to say something he doesn't believe in.
With her many other commitments and responsibilities in that Glasgow campaign, there she was for 8-9 weeks absolutely solidly. I've always greatly depended upon her political wisdom and advice. And she could have been a very effective politician herself. She showed her dedication to campaigning when she thought I was right. And I didn't often do things I'd been frightened to, which she didn't think was right.
As they waited for the Hillhead result, Jennifer Jenkins could reflect on nearly 40 years as the wife of a pleasure-loving politician.
I suppose everybody's marriage goes slightly up and down. I don't think that we neither of us ever speak a harsh word to each other. That would hardly be true. We certainly don't, not true that we would never have a disagreement. But we've certainly never had a rift, what I would call a serious rift.
Well, we did do it after all.
Jenkins had kept score of every hand he'd shaken in the campaign. It amounted to over 5,000.
Do you want to be Prime Minister?
I want to offer a new choice and a new hope to the people of Britain. If that involves my offering myself for the Prime Ministership, obviously I'm not going to say no.
Jenkins looked forward to returning to the scene of his former parliamentary triumphs. But he was to discover from the moment he went in to claim his seat that in the Thatcherite 80s, the Commons had become a much rougher and tougher place.
He came in and stood opposite me as I was sat in the corner seat, and he seemed to be there for a while. So I said, "What's up with you, bud?" He said, "Well, it's traditional for leaders of parties to occupy the corner seats. You bear in mind that David Steele was in the corner seat just above me." I says, "Well, I always thought it was traditional for you, when you came to Parliament, to get your hands on that dispatch box." I said, "You'd not been in the place 5 minutes before you were rubbing its edges. And now you want to sit with the rebels? Take your hook."
I hated the Commons then. I couldn't. It was a bit later on, in the 83 Parliament, towards the end of that, I had some speeches which went well and which I enjoyed making, but I found it very difficult to adjust to the new House of Commons. Perhaps I found it difficult to adjust to not having a dispatch box, not being a front bencher on either side, not having cheering cohorts behind me.
His style was wrong for the House of Commons, and he wasn't a good leader of the struggling new party. He wasn't a good leader of the struggling new party, not because he didn't have ideas and eloquence and reason, but because he found it extremely difficult to handle the heckling, the sourness, the bitterness, the epithets that were flung across the chamber at him.
Perhaps I'd got a little stiff and less quick than I used to be. But whereas I'd on the whole, had considerable triumphs in the Commons in the early days, I found it very difficult to get back a position of authority and enjoyment in a small party in that House of Commons of the mid-80s.
But it wasn't just the Commons. Jenkins was also having problems within his own party. David Owen had stood against him for the party leadership, believing that Jenkins was a closet liberal with an out-of-date patrician style, while Owen claimed the new party needed a leader with his own younger, tougher and more radical image.
I think he did an enormous amount of damage. And although I was keen to have him in the early days, we'd have been much better off without him. Much better off if he hadn't come in 1981.
It would have been much more honourable for Roy Jenkins to have joined the Liberal Party. He would have then become the leader of the Liberal Party, which would have added strength and support to it, and he didn't then have to pretend to be a socialist and let those of us who wanted to be social democrats be social democrats.
Well, there's to me a certain inherent comic quality about David Owen lecturing me about not being socialist enough. Because my position, of course, has remained far more consistently left of centre than his has done.
David Owen says that you were an old man in a hurry, and the SDP was just a disposable vehicle for your ambition to become Prime Minister.
That's nonsense. If anyone disposed of the SDP, it was Owen, not me.
After 7 years, the party was rolled up in anger. It had failed to make the decisive breakthrough. The left claimed that the SDP's only effect was to help keep Mrs. Thatcher in power for a decade. But Jenkins says its lasting contribution has been on the Labour Party itself.
I think that the Labour Party, without the shock of the SDP and without the shock of its disastrous own election results in the 80s, would have gone on the course which it was gradually adopting throughout the 70s and making itself into a remote sect in advocating increasingly out-of-the-way politics. And I think that the Blair Labour Party owes a great deal to the SDP.
I mean, are you a supporter of Tony Blair?
I think that Tony Blair is the best leader of the Labour Party since Hugh Gaitskell.
Roy Jenkins has become something of a mentor to Tony Blair and is now a behind-the-scenes influence on New Labour, which is quite short of old statesmen.
Can't see any great interest.
The Jenkins have had Blair come discreetly for a family lunch at their country home. But Fergus Jenkins was less impressed than his grandfather by Tony Blair.
I thought it was rather rude of him not just to talk to one specific person, my granddad. I thought he might talk to other people.
You mean when Tony Blair came to lunch here?
Yes.
And you were here, were you?
Yes, I was.
And he didn't talk to you?
No.
I hope, none of us can know until it's put to the proof, I hope that if he is Prime Minister, Tony Blair will be a very good Social Democratic Prime Minister.
But if you believe that about Tony Blair, why don't you give him the boost of rejoining the Labour Party?
Because apart from anything else, it would be ridiculous to change parties again, because I have a strong commitment to Paddy Ashdown.
Roy Jenkins' son Edward says that on the croquet lawn, his father shows the killer instinct that was less obviously on display in his political career.
Great object to keep your own two balls together and separate the other two balls.
At the age of 75, Roy Jenkins could still become the eminence grise of a new Labour government, though that's not, of course, the same as holding the top job oneself.
Oh yes, I would have liked to have been Prime Minister, and there were times when I wanted very much to be Prime Minister, and thought quite a bit about whether I would or would not become Prime Minister. But my life is not remotely crushed by not having been Prime Minister. And indeed, looking round, I think I'm rather happier and have a rather more agreeable life in my 70s than most of those who have been Prime Minister. Got to go back home now.
It's natural